the New York Utica mission, it's unique in that if you ask me about any famous place in New York, they were not in my mission, except for like Syracuse and Albany. But, people know Manhattan, they know Long Island, they know Brooklyn, the Bronx, they know Fayette, they know Rochester, they know Palmyra. Those are not in my mission, in the New York Utica mission, which is interesting because all the other three missions, the New York North, New York South, and Palmyra mission, can all geographically fit in that mission. And so it's the biggest of the missions, but there's not really much that people know big cities wise. Like there's 3, maybe 4 big cities, but other than that, there's a lot of rural towns, a lot of country that you don't expect when I first thought of New York. You think of the concrete jungle or skyscrapers, but there was a lot of country roads, a lot of just down to earth good people, and so the religious aspects of it, as in terms of the growth of the church, it was very interesting. Somebody described it to me like in parts of the mission, it's where a prophet is not accepted in his own country. I remember one area near the southern border, which is where Joseph Smith first went to jail. It was in that area, in the South Bainbridge area, where I was on an exchange there, and a gentleman we were talking to on the street, and he said, "Oh, you don't need to tell me anything about Joseph Smith. My grandpa personally knew him, saw him walk on water, and knew he was a fraud." And so he told me all about that. And, afterwards we could walk away thinking, well, if your grandpa was born the day Joseph died, he'd have to be 200 years old, sort of a deal. But there was a lot of that, still that anti-feeling of like when the church left in certain areas. And so it was a very unique dynamic to be able to see that. But in other parts, the church picked up and they left and nobody knew anything about the church. And so, but when it came to teaching wise, it was very interesting that we would focus a lot on the Savior, that the majority of the people I taught did not know who Jesus Christ was. They just knew he was some guy, but nobody really had faith. And so the main religions of the time, I would say, were like, there's a lot of Catholics, there's a lot of Jews, but there's also a lot of agnostics that don't really know. And so the Catholics, their grandparents went to church, and so, just through the christening process, they are Catholic, but they haven't been to church in the past 12 years. Not to say everybody, but that's a good majority part. So they don't know who Christ is and his atonement. Jews, obviously, they don't know or care about the Savior. And then, agnostics, not a lot of people know if there's a God, and if there is, who he is. And so it was really neat to help people say their first prayer, or to help them receive an answer and to learn about who Jesus Christ is in this modern world. And so we use the Book of Mormon to mostly do that, because it testifies of Christ and that he can give them answers and he can be there for them, and so on and so forth. And so it was really a neat experience. Yes, we talked about Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, but it was a lot of people don't know, which was shocking to me on my mission, that there's a lot of people, even in religions, that don't know the details of Christ's life, who had been going to church all their life, yet they didn't really know. And so that was really neat for me. There's a lot of unknown church history in my mission. All the famous church history sites, like the Priesthood Restoration site, or the Sacred Grove, or Fayette, where the church was restored and organized. Those are all part of the Palmyra mission or Pennsylvania mission. But mine, there's a lot of stuff where it's not really recognized. So, for example, like Brigham Young was a builder. He built homes in my mission, and before he met Joseph Smith, and he was able to do things like that. Parley P. Pratt was born in my mission. There's not like a sign that says this is the home of Parley P. Pratt, but there's a lot of things like that, because a lot of people, that's where the church was started. And so some recognized, owned by the church sites that are really neat is the Colesville branch, which was the first branch of the church, is in my mission, and the original building is still there, and it has the list of the members. And then nearby, there's a place, the Newell Knight Home, which is where Joseph went and was helped in the translating process, and Newell Knight helped him a lot in everything that he was doing. And so that's before they went to Pennsylvania, to Harmony. There was a lot of, work that way. And so those two are owned by the church and recognized, which is really cool to be able to see and walk through the house, but it's not as well known as any other sites. But Emma and Joseph were married in my mission, and there's a state marker on the side, historic marker, that says Joseph and Emily Hale, misspelled her name, were married here. And there's places that say Joseph Smith was sent to jail here. So, but there's not really, those prominent ones. There's a lot of interesting things that you pick up along the way. There are 4 stakes and 1 district in my mission. They vary in size. The district used to be a stake, and then when certain things happened, it became a district. And so that's a pretty small area of the church. My last area was in that district, and the branch, back then, we had 25 members that would average come into church on Sunday. And so it was interesting to me because, you think stateside, where it's like, okay, the church is prominent in the States, but you never really hear of like 25 members coming to church. And so that was a shock to me. The church is still very young in some parts of the mission because everybody just left and went to Missouri and Nauvoo and Salt Lake. And so the district is pretty small, but the stakes, they're growing, they're all growing really well. And since I've been home, I've been in contact with my companions. They've said that the missionary work, the efforts and the success rate has doubled since I left. And so there's a lot of growth going on and a lot of success happening in the mission. We take up parts of Pennsylvania and Vermont geographically. So I don't know why, because the parts where we take Vermont, the Vermont mission takes a little bit of our mission. So it's just the way the stakes works out. But there's one stake where it's really like Utah, that there's, averaging 250 to 300 members in a ward, actively attending. And then some parts, you have branches with 25 members. And so there's a big varying dynamic there. But the way that missionary work needs to happen is, like has been said, the huge thing that's been being pushed is member missionary work, that having them involved. I rarely tracked it on my mission. I know a lot of missionaries in my mission tracked it, but if I was being honest, I probably tracked it 10 hours my entire mission. And so, not to say I didn't go out in the streets and talk to people. That was more effective, just standing on the street, people walking by, and talking with them. But tracking-wise, I rarely went door to door. I mean, that's a thing of the past, in my opinion. And from what I talked to missionaries, they said the same thing, that they did it to be obedient, but they didn't find much success. And we found the most success when it came from, referrals and talking with the members and getting a good relationship with the members. I love the members. I'm in contact with them still today, 18 months later, and they love the missionaries, and so they want to help out. They just need to know that they can trust you, and then they help out. I would say that faith is a huge thing, and I know we say that, like we talk about faith all the time, but I remember in one area we kind of really had faith, but we didn't have the faith of like, I believe something, more of the faith of the action and to go and to do. And so we believed that we could accomplish what seemed to us a very impossible thing to do. But when we put our belief to it and then set the plans to make it, we achieved it, and we looked back and thought, how was that even possible? And so I would say that knowing what I know now, that planning with faith is a huge thing. That kind of this idea that you can do whatever you want as a missionary. Really, like there's agency, other people's agency, but things that you can control, you honestly can do whatever you want to do. Like there's no dream that's too big. There's no vision that's too high, as you work with God, and you can do those things. And so I would say set a goal and then make a plan, and the Spirit will lead you along the way, but push yourself. There's no growth in the comfort zone. And so that was just a huge thing for me, that if I would have gone back, I would go back to my first area, knowing what I learned from that area where we pushed ourselves, and we could have probably doubled, tripled our efforts just because we believed we could and then worked for it effectively. And so I think going along with that, there's an idea that missionaries need to learn of working smarter, not harder. And so working smart, working with the members, doing things effectively rather than tracting for 10 hours, doing things smarter. And then that would have helped a lot my first area if I was working smarter. It's President Joseph B. Worthland Jr., and so he was Elder Worthland's only son. So he's not the mission president anymore. It's currently President Rogers. I never met President Rogers. He left. He arrived 2 weeks after I left. But President Worthland was very interesting, a lot of unique things. Being the son of an apostle, I remember being in interviews where we're just talking, and he's like, oh, I remember President Packer pulled me aside and told me this, or, things like that. One thing that I use today is he asked his dad for advice when he was a bishop. He's like, okay, I need some advice. And his dad, Elder Worthland, said, well, there's two things you need to know in the church. The first is you got to love them. And the second is you got to feed them. And so it's so true, every activity we go to, the young men ask, is there going to be food? And usually there will be. But, he talked about how, like, physically you need to feed people, but you also need to feed them spiritually. That goes with it. And so that's kind of stuck with me now in my home teaching. You got to love them and you got to feed them. And, I can't feed them physically, but spiritually, And so that's a interesting little saying. But before he was the mission president, he was over the church, the church's temporal affairs, so like buildings, cars, things of that nature. And so he told us a story one time that he was the fleet manager in Salt Lake City, and President Hinckley had just gotten a new car. And that day, President Hinckley, the day he got the new car, he disappeared. And, he had meetings, being the prophet, you have a lot of stuff to do. But he was gone. Nobody knew where he was. The bodyguards didn't know and people were scared. No, they were wondering, where's the prophet? That's kind of a big deal. And so he arrived later that night, and he called my mission president, President Worthland, saying, Joseph, the car works. And so he had taken the car out for a joyride, and nobody knows where he went, but he was the prophet, and he was going to go drive his car, not have somebody drive him before him. So just little stories like that. And so it was really neat. And Sister Worthland, every mission president's wife, I don't know because I only know mine, but was just absolutely the best. She was great. She was like my mother. She was the medical coordinator, and so, which I think is the same for Sister Rogers now. And so it was a joke among the missionaries that if you broke your leg, you'd call her and say, oh, I need help. And she'd say, well, did you drink water first? Just that's all we heard. Zone conference, mission conference, district meetings. Make sure you drink water. Make sure you drink water. And so we're all pretty hydrated because of it. So I guess that's good. I served from 2013 to 2015. I started in a city called Fayetteville, which is just the west side of Syracuse. Nope, the east side of Syracuse. And then after I was there for about 4 months, 3 transfers, and then I moved to a city called Oneonta, which is about half an hour south of the Baseball Hall of Fame, Cooperstown. And I was there for quite a while, about 8 months. Then I went to a small town called Amsterdam, I was there a very short period of time, about 2 months, and that's north of Albany. And then I served in a place called Elmira, which is near the Pennsylvania border. Um, that's that's the ward where we take in the Pennsylvania side of the mission, and so we would go to Pennsylvania and see a lot of Amish, and so I was there for very briefly too, about 2 months, and then I finished my mission um, about 15 miles south of Canada in a place called Malone, um, and I was there for the remainder of my mission, about 8 months.